The loss of 7 warships and 2,000 seamen in only 5 days finally persuaded Admiral D he had reached the limit. Crete had been abandoned. Admiral Cunningham reviewed their orders and resolved, stop all evacuation efforts at once. That decision meant thousands of Allied troops were left to be taken prisoner or worse. Cunningham realized his career and name hung in the balance. Still, as he put it, it takes 3 years to build a ship, 300 years to build a tradition. Whether honor or stubbornness, he refused to desert those men. On 31st May 1941, HMS Phoebe received commands that directly contradicted London, returned to Crete. She could only carry 3,500 souls, yet the sands at Spakia held almost 10,000, and everyone there knew this vessel was the final lifeline from Crete. Launched in 1940 from Fairfield shipyards at Govan, Scotland, HMS Phoebe slid her hull into the Clyde's icy water. This Dino-class cruiser measured 156 meters, longer than a football pitch, with a 15.4-meter beam that cut through the sea near 60 km/h. Built for speed and strike operations rather than heavy protection, she moved like a predator rather than a brute. Her deck bristled with firepower. 8 133mm guns in twin turrets ready to rip into any target, 2 quadruple 40mm anti-aircraft mounts, and 6 533mm torpedo tubes completing a fearsome loadout. Phoebe joined the Royal Navy on 30 September. She began service with the Home Fleet, patrolling the North Atlantic from the grim anchorage of Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands. Drills in gunnery and torpedo work hardened the crew, while rare chances for rest were often sacrificed. The sailors grew tough against the ever-present menace of German surface raiders and submarines lurking underwater. For Vic Chanter, a junior medical assistant aboard his first ship, life aboard became an intense education in keeping men alive, from treating seasickness to tending wounds from violent weather and skirmishes. The tiny sickbay turned into the crew's sole sanctuary, and stocking Eastman pills to combat seasickness became a near-obsessive task. When April 1941 arrived, orders swept Phoebe out of the frozen north and thrust her toward the Mediterranean on a punishing voyage around Africa. They detoured well clear of the submarine-infested Strait of Pantelia, calling at Gibraltar, Freetown, Durban, Mombasa, and Utton before transiting the Suez Canal into Alexandria. They were entering a theater already earning the grim label, the graveyard of British cruisers. By the time HMSB reached the Mediterranean, German and Italian forces were tearing through Greece, while Britain, already strained by the North African fighting, diverted scarce units to help the Greeks. Rommel's Africa Corps was massing in the desert, preparing to smash at depleted Allied lines. It was into this chaos Phoebe was thrown, the desperate evacuation of British and Empire forces from Greece. On 27 April 1941, alongside destroyers, HMS Defender, HMS Harrowing, and HMS Hero, Phoebe acted as a lifeline, rescuing everyone aboard the Dutch troop ship Costa Rica, 2,600 soldiers and her crew. HMS Kolkata, another Dino-class cruiser, worked alongside her sisters, snatching 960 troops from Nafplio while laying down anti-aircraft cover as convoys endured relentless German air attacks. Phoebe then carried out 3 dangerous nocturnal runs from the Greek mainland, picking up troops from Kalamata on the southern shore. Her small boats risked coming dangerously close to German forces to ferry exhausted and wounded men aboard. In the sickbay, Vic Chanter saw the terrible toll. Soldiers with horrific injuries, some barely able to crawl. Thousands of Allied servicemen, British, Australian, and New Zealand troops found themselves trapped after the grueling withdrawal from mainland Greece. Supplies were nearly exhausted, ammunition ran low, and morale was frayed, though not yet broken. Many of those Phoebe and Kolkata rescued were later disembarked on the island of Crete. Then the Germans unleashed a fresh nightmare on the islands. Strategic positions. A huge airborne assault, paratroopers raining down from the sky. Hitler committed everything to seize this crucial Mediterranean stepping stone, and the ferocity of the advance forced defenders across the island toward the southern shores. Major General E.C. Weston and his senior officers, including New Zealander Freyberg, faced an impossible dilemma as their formations crumbled under overwhelming force, outmaneuvered and outgunned. Hour by hour, the German juggernaut closed the noose around the remaining defenders. Further east, isolated garrisons at Radimo and Heracleion fought cut off from the main evacuation. The Australians holding Radimo ran desperately short of supplies, and, unaware of the evacuation unfolding to the south, were effectively abandoned, surrounded and facing almost certain capture as German units sealed off their positions. Above Crete, the air was torn by screaming dive bombers, while machine gun bursts rattled along the stony slopes. Any chance of escape demanded separate planning and a stroke of fortune, if it was to succeed at all, so the main body of Allied troops began a slow, tormented pullback toward what they prayed would be salvation at Spakia. The evacuation order fell on 29th of May, 1941, when Major General Weston gathered his shattered staff to map out their withdrawal. The remnants of Crete force would move back under cover of darkness, with the 4th and 5th New Zealand Brigades spearheading the painful march to the beaches, followed by the 19th Australian Brigade and a Royal Marine Battalion. The men hoped the whole force might be lifted by the night of 30th of May, but the Germans kept pressing. By afternoon, the 23rd New Zealand Battalion found itself clinging to the north entrance of the Escafou Plain as German mountain troops pummeled their positions, the crack of Mauser rifles echoing off the crags. The New Zealanders dug into the bottleneck road, Lee Enfield spitting fire at the advancing Germans, while lean, seasoned mountain troops carved dusty lines across the rock with light machine guns as wave after wave surged forward. Mortar bombs shrieked in, ripping at earth and sending plumes of stone and soil skyward. The Allied men beat back attack after attack, even as their ranks thinned and ammunition dwindled. At last, covered by their own suppressing fire, they pulled back in a bitter, orderly withdrawal, staggering but intact, to rejoin the 5th Brigade, near Kitades, only about 5 kilometers from Spakia, while German units prowled relentlessly. Far to the east, a separate drama unfolded as the garrison at Heracleion tried its own evacuation. A naval group of 2 cruisers and 6 destroyers steamed out of Egypt under the dark, among them HMS Kolkata, a veteran of countless hazardous runs. They managed to take nearly 4,000 British troops off the island, packing men into every spare inch. Escape proved only temporary relief. On the return voyage to Alexandria, the convoy was delayed by damage to ships, and German aircraft descended on the clustered vessels in a storm of bombs and gunfire, sending many of the rescued to watery graves. Dawn on 30th of May 1941 brought no respite as German mountain troops closed on Spakia after the New Zealand withdrawal through the night, seizing the Escafou Plain and engaging further forces near Imros, only 16 kilometers from the evacuation beaches. The Australian 27th Battalion stood as a thin line of resistance, holding the road while the German commander tried to turn them by driving troops into 2 savage ravines flanking their position. In the Sakiana ravine to the west, advancing Germans collided with parts of the 20th Battalion under Colonel Howard Kippenberger's fierce command. The colonel sent 1 company, including 2nd Lieutenant Charles Upham's platoon, to take the high ground and seal the ravine. Upham's exhausted men forced their way up the 183-meter hill west of the ravine, every step a struggle under fatigue and wounds. At the crest, they spread their platoon along the slope with rifles trained on the floor below. Upham pushed on higher with his weapon, 2 riflemen at his side, dropping low and waiting with breath held as enemy shapes crept nearer. From about 500 yards they opened up, shredding the attackers and forcing a panicked withdrawal. 2 hours after the ascent, Upham's platoon returned with their report. 22 enemy soldiers had been neutralized. For that action and earlier daring deeds on Crete, Charles Upham would be awarded the Victoria Cross. Yet bravery could not conjure the ships needed to lift thousands from Crete Force HQ. Freiberg and the other commanders faced a grim arithmetic of lives. Each of the 4 destroyers expected after dark could take only 500 men. The 4th and 5th Brigades were chosen to embark, but limited space meant not all of the 5th Brigade could go. Brigadier James Harris was forced to make the crushing decision that the 21st Battalion would remain. The 18th Battalion was assigned to man an armed perimeter around the beach. Then worse news came from Alexandria. The evacuation was being cut back again to just 250 men per destroyer because of the risk to crowded ships from air attack. For the troops of the 5th Brigade, it meant enduring another night of hell on Crete. To make matters worse, only 2 destroyers arrived. Mechanical failures and bomb damage kept the others away. Yet still 400 men were taken aboard that night as the entire 4th Brigade squeezed past the Ardennes cordon. Men who had lost their units begged to be taken, creating a scene that left Colonel Kippenberger feeling bitterly ashamed. As night deepened, Sunderland flying boats carried Freiberg and senior staff away, leaving thousands behind to listen to the sound of German engines growing nearer with each hour. Dawn on 31st May found some 9,000 Allied soldiers huddled in and around Spakia, clinging to the faint hope of rescue. In Alexandria, General Weil faced the grim reality of mounting naval losses, ships battered, sunk or crippled by relentless air attack, and was forced to decide that the coming night's evacuation would be the absolute last. 4 destroyers had been allotted at first, a scant promise of rescue for so many lives. Then a frantic plea across the Mediterranean refused to let the story end there. In Alexandria, New Zealand's Prime Minister Peter Fraser, upon learning that 31 May would be the final night, felt fury and resolve at the thought of thousands of his countrymen abandoned to capture, a blow to New Zealand's war effort he would not tolerate. Fraser went straight to Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham, Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet, and did more than appeal. He pressed, argued, and effectively demanded greater effort for the trapped soldiers. Cunningham faced a terrible bind. London had ordered the evacuations halted because losses were unsustainable, yet Fraser's urgent entreaty cut through the fatigue and the cold calculations of strategy. The admiral, who had already sacrificed ships, would not renounce his honor or desert men still fighting. He famously said, "It takes 3 years to build a ship, 300 years to build a tradition." Defying orders and against the odds, Cunningham commanded HMS Phoebe, a ship already scarred by combat, to turn back to Crete. It was a last-ditch mission with a thin crew and slim chances of survival. Night shrouded Crete as Phoebe carved through the waves on her desperate return to Spakia. Captain Guy Grantham spoke over the ship's public address, laying out the grim nature of their task to evacuate the remnants of the army from Greece and now Crete, bluntly calling their prospects discouraging. Every sailor knew for many this could be a one-way voyage. They were going to risk the enemy fleet and the Luftwaffe to try to save stranded men. Ships slipped into Spakia Bay with navigation lights extinguished. Guided by Lieutenant Lumsden's expert handling, and the beats revealed controlled chaos, thousands of hollow-eyed, exhausted soldiers surging toward the shore. News had spread that this was the last night, and space was limited to some 3,500 men, only a fraction of those still trapped. Priority was given to the infantry hardest hit by the German onslaught. The 4th and 5th Brigades, the 19th Brigade, and a Royal Marine Battalion. To prevent a panicked rush that could doom the whole operation, commanders established a fresh armed cordon, a picket line that held back stragglers as Colonel Howard Kippenberger's 20th Battalion moved to the beach, passing pleading men and those staring blankly. Kippenberger later said the order was to fire on anyone who tried to break the line. Somehow, nearly 4,000 troops, including 80 walking wounded, were crammed aboard the ships, decks becoming a human carpet as men scrambled up onto Phoebe amid a flood of mixed relief and grief. Escape brought joy for those leaving, but deep sorrow for the thousands left ashore. Phoebe's crew, including Vic Chanter, watched an endless tide of weary faces. On the heaving decks, men stood shoulder to shoulder, the weight dragging the vessels low in the water. Silhouettes rolling beyond the surf like slow, swollen prizes for enemy bombers and submarines hunting the area. Once the last soldiers were aboard, HMS Phoebe and HMS Abdeel slipped away from Crete in the pre-dawn dark, packed with thousands and beginning a hazardous run across the Mediterranean. Every increase in speed felt like a wager against the coming daylight. As bridge officers peered into the black dawn ripped open to reveal the convoy as scattered small shapes on a vast sea, and almost at once Ju-88s and Stuka dive bombers screamed in, engines bellowing as they dove in coordinated strikes. Dick Chanter would later recall the blue sky blackening with tracer and bombs falling toward the waves, ships twisted in frantic evasive moves. Attackers peeled away to plunge at Phoebe's stern, while Captain Grantham barked orders and the helm swung the great ship hard to starboard. Waterspouts burst around them as bombs struck the sea. Men clung to anything solid to avoid being hurled across decks, while the vessel shuddered and creaked under the strain. Despite exhaustion, the crews kept up a furious tempo. Anti-aircraft guns stuttered defiantly, and captains threw their ships into wild turns to avoid hits, forming a scattered but still moving armada that fought on against overwhelming danger. Back in Alexandria, a tense vigil played out as Peter Fraser and Admiral Cunningham stood on the docks before dawn, scanning the horizon and hoping Phoebe and the other ships would emerge from their midnight gamble. After a long, threatened voyage, the battered convoy finally limped into Alexandria. A wave of relief swept through the packed soldiers and exhausted sailors as thousands who had endured days with scant food or sleep finally fell onto solid ground. The crew of the ships had barely slept themselves, perhaps only 15 to 20 hours across 4 punishing days, but they took comfort in having delivered their human cargo out of Crete's grasp. For those left behind after the island's evacuation, roughly 5,000 troops faced grim prospects. Most surrendered and spent years in harsh prisoner camps across Europe, while others fled into the hills with local help, joining resistance groups or attempting sea escapes, acts that exposed civilian helpers to brutal German reprisals. MS. Phoebe's return with some 3,700 soldiers vindicated Admiral Cunningham's refusal to obey standing orders, even as losses in the Mediterranean kept mounting. On the 1st June 1941, HMS Kolkata steamed toward Alexandria after successfully lifting nearly 4,000 troops from Heraklion, about 100 nautical miles from safety. Her seasoned hull cut through the Mediterranean swell when suddenly Ju-88s appeared on the horizon. The twin-engined attackers dove through broken cloud, their bomb-laden runs aimed at the converted anti-aircraft cruiser as her guns spun upward, tracer tearing the sky. 2 bombs struck home. The first ripped through the forward sections and the second detonated amidships, tearing huge holes and sending torrents of seawater into her compartments. Kolkata's veteran crew fought the flooding hard, but the damage was overwhelming. The Mediterranean took another ship as the cruiser rolled to starboard, and her superstructure sank beneath the waves, while HMS Coventry raced in to rescue survivors. The casualty count was brutal. 2 officers and 116 ratings lost beneath the sea, while 23 officers and 232 enlisted men were hauled from the water, a small mercy against such catastrophic loss. The sinking underscored that even successful evacuations exacted terrible prices and helped seal the Admiral's decision to halt further lifts from the island. In the end, some 16,500 to 18,000 were evacuated from Crete and up to 50,000 from Greece, but the victory came at a savage cost. The so-called graveyard of British cruisers claimed 7 warships and several merchant vessels, and some 2,000 seamen were lost. Still, gratitude ran deep. The New Zealand Army held a large celebration in Alexandria aboard HMS Phoebe, where Admiral Cunningham flew his flag from her mast, a potent emblem of solidarity. A New Zealand delegation presented a substantial fund for the families of lost Royal Navy men, and their words struck a chord. We in the Army did not worry much. While we were retreating to the beaches, we knew the Navy would be there, and our hopes and wishes came true. That simple sentiment echoed the lives pulled back from the brink. Phoebe received little rest after Crete. She plunged straight back into Mediterranean duty, escorting convoys and supply ships along the Libyan coast. On 27 August 1941, an Italian torpedo bomber struck with devastating effect, tearing an 18-meter gash in her hull below the bridge and down toward the keel, large enough to drive a double-decker bus through. Yet Phoebe refused to sink. Her watertight bulkheads held, and frantic damage control saw the crew jettison 3 torpedoes, an anchor, and a motorboat to stabilize the ship. She limped back to Alexandria for temporary repairs, and then undertook a harrowing 19,000-kilometer voyage to New York for full restoration. After the war, she would be broken up for scrap in 1956, but her survival through so much damage became part of her legacy. Admiral Andrew Cunningham's career, marked by leadership in major, Allied naval operations and eventual elevation to First Sea Lord, might never have unfolded as it did had he not defied orders to rescue his men during the heroic Crete evacuation.